Pokémon has always experimented with different trends in game design as it's evolved throughout the years. In 2013, we saw the move from 2D pixel art games to 3D models. In 2016, we saw the end of the top-down approach and the beginning of a less grid-based world. And in 2019, and more so in 2022, we saw Pokémon experimenting with open zones and a fully open world for their Pokémon games. However, it's fair to say that each of these has been divisive. So now, I'd like to take a look at these worlds, their successes and their failings, bring in a bit of discussion from other open world games, and most importantly of all, discuss if open world is the way forward for the series, and how I would do it in the future. I'm just going to preface this by saying that this video is coming out before Legends EA releases, so while we will be discussing that game in this video, I won't be commenting on the world of that game particularly, as I've not yet gotten the chance to experience it. In time, I may end up making a follow-up video where I look into it if I feel that Lumio City improved on the open world from Scarlet and Violet. With all of that being said, let's get right into the video. I think it's more than fair to say that Pokémon took their time to give us an open world experience. The games were entirely linear and progression based, with you unlocking more of the world as you progressed in the story, with the world's most random roadblocks, right up until Generation 7. While the same would mostly be true of Sword and Shield, they were the first games to properly experiment with an open zone, the wild area. Now it's safe to say that this was not the best first introduction for an open zone in Pokémon. The graphics were horrible, the design of the area itself was not fantastic, the place felt pretty much the same throughout, the music was fine but there were a total of 2 tracks for the entire wild area, the weather system was horrific, and so many other problems that people faced in this area. People weren't happy. Ever since the game's launch, this has been one of the biggest issues that people have had with the game. It certainly didn't help that the first impression we got of it during the Nintendo Treehouse at E3 2019 was entirely during rain, which, while being very accurate to British weather, made the area look even more dull due to the grey sky and tanking the frame rate. Not to mention the over-the-top complaining that went on due to the model used for the trees here. But there were a lot of positives as well. It was the first time that Pokémon had attempted an open zone, and honestly it was far from as bad as it could have been. It was split into 2 sections, both of which were accessible from the get-go, but one was significantly harder than the other, with stronger Pokémon. You also had all of the max raid dens across the wild area, introducing max raid battles. Despite the environmental similarity, there was actually a wide variety of Pokémon found across the wild area. Although not many new ones from the Galar region, it was mostly kind of classic Pokémon, but it was also the first time that we'd see kind of evolution Pokémon that would previously not have been available in the wild, such as Gengar and Rhyperior, available in the open world. I honestly think that the biggest problem that the wild area has was just how empty it felt. Aside from the wild Pokémon and max raid battles, there was just very little to do in the wild area. There was a grand total of 1 trainer battle in the entire area, which is a case of one NPC who just shows up randomly and fights with all 3 Galar starters at different stages of evolution, depending on where you are in the game. Which is at least one thing it did right: scaling. Outside of that, however, there are just so few NPCs around, a couple with things to sell you, and one nursery that just feels really pointless, especially when there's a nursery pretty close by, which you can just fly to whenever. It just felt completely unnecessary, it felt very empty, and it kind of... We kind of needed more from the wild area in terms of characters there. As for the DLC for Sword and Shield, 2 more wild areas were added, the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra. Both of these were pretty good improvements on the base wild area, but still had issues of their own. They still had nothing in the way of trainers outside of both having a once-a-day battle against the main NPCs of their story, Avery or Clara, Mustard and Peony. But what made these so much better was that they didn't feel as disjointed from the rest of the region as the wild area did. Both the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra were set entirely in their open zones, with us seeing structures for the first time in the Isle of Armor and a full-on village in the Crown Tundra. The fact that both only got 1 piece of music each was a tad frustrating, as they can get old pretty quick, and both still lacked much of anything to do outside of max raid battles and wild encounters, aside from their respective stories of course, but the improvement was noticeable. The Isle of Armor's size was comparable to the wild areas, although I think there's possibly a bit too much empty water space with nothing really to do there other than be chased by wild Sharpedo, but the Crown Tundra had a much larger open area with much more variable environment. The Isle of Armor was good in this regard as well, with there being a beach, marshland, forest, caves, and even a desert. The Crown Tundra was mostly wintry in feel, but there were grasslands, a graveyard, caves, a large ice field, and some steep hills. In comparison to what we saw in the wild area, it was a much needed improvement. Also, having the story take place in these areas worked very well, as it made the zones feel lived in, even if there were very few NPCs in either. So, did the addition of the wild area add much to Sword and Shield? The original one didn't, to be honest. All it did was add a new disjointed part of the map, which felt stitched on, rather than an intended part of the experience. The XP candies from max raid battles also made gaining experience and leveling up Pokemon super easy, so by the time you got to Turffield and took on the first gym, you already had a pretty good team and usually with a mid-stage starter. After that, you can pretty easily coast through the game if you do enough max raid battles in between. Admittedly, this replacement for standard grinding is a lot more fun, and I really like that I can control which Pokemon in my party can get experience and how much. The Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra also greatly improved on the usage of open zones in the game's progression, tying it into the story, with the Crown Tundra especially making you really explore to unlock all of its secrets, something I honestly really adore. It's very, very clear that Sword and Shield started life as a 3DS game, with the addition of the wild area being a later decision added when development moved to the Switch. I'd be intrigued to know what Galar would look like without it, how it would be laid out. Would Turffield have come earlier? It does seem to fit closely with Wedgehurst and Postwick in terms of design. I doubt we'll ever see this, if it's even had a final design before the addition of the wild area. There is just one more thing I want to talk about in regards to the wild areas of Sword and Shield, and that is their environmental storytelling and world building. When it comes to game design, I tend to focus on narrative and audio, so it's definitely something that I kind of want to discuss when it comes to analysing games. The world area itself has very little in the way of environmental storytelling, with most of that being left to the roots and towns of Galar, such as the hill carving in Turffield and the mural in Stow-on-Side. You do have areas like the Watchtower, but there's no real detailing as to how that came to be or what it was in the past. It feels more like an excuse just to have a ghost-type area. Comparing this to other games in the series with ruins and ghost-type areas such as Mount Pyre in Hoenn or Relic Castle and the Abyssal Ruins in Unova, they all get more story and explanation, and you understand what purpose they serve in the region. The Watchtower has its own strange properties that I'm investigating for a follow-up to my Area Zero video, but we never get any sort of lore explanation for it whatsoever. And that's one of the major landmarks in the wild area. You also have a number of areas called the Giant's something, whether it be the Giant's Seat or Giant's Cap, and even extends into the Crown Tundra with the Giant's Foot and Giant's Bed. While it feels as though this should be referring to something to do with Dynamax or possibly even Eternatus, there's no way that Eternatus, even its Eternamax form, grew to be the length of the wild area and the top half of the Crown Tundra. However, there's no other explanation, which I think is a shame. There's a lot you could do with that as a concept, but it unfortunately goes completely unexplained. There are a number of other areas in the base game's wild area that could have done with being given some more world building, like the rock that can evolve Galarian Yamask into Rune Regus. All those details could have made the world feel a little more fulfilling. Could have made that discovery feel more like a discovery. But unfortunately, right now it just feels disappointing. As for the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra, they're much the same. The Isle of Armor has that weird Dynamax tree thing where you go with Hop to find the Dynamax Vespiquen. That tree always felt like it should connect to the other enormous tree, the Dyna tree in the Crown Tundra, where the Galarian legendary birds reside. But there is no spoken or implied connection at all. Not to mention all of the other locations in the Crown Tundra like the Reggie Ruins and the Max Lair. The only really location that we get any information for is the Crown Shrine, as it's part of the main story of the Crown Tundra. But why does any of this actually matter? Well, it's because giving additional details to locations can really enhance a player's experience of exploring the world. Small narrative details can spark theories in players' heads, and make them want to explore more to learn more about the world. Now, I know that this doesn't work for everyone, but there's a good chunk of the Pokemon fandom who would absolutely eat this up, myself included. So we've taken a look at the strengths and failings of the wild area, and as well as the DLCs. So now let's go a bit further and look at Legends Arceus, how it improved on the open zones, but also the mistakes that it made. Legends Arceus took a similar approach to Sword and Shield, in that it didn't go for a fully open world, but rather smaller open zones. However, that's pretty much where the similarities end. In comparison to the one open zone in Sword and Shield's base game, split by a menacing bridge, Legends Arceus has 5 fully separate open zones, each with a very different environment. There's the Obsidian Fieldlands, which is all grass and hillsides, with some rocky parts, and the forest that would eventually become Eterna Forest as well. You've got a few islands dotted around in Lake Verity. Then there's the Crimson Mirelands, which, as the name implies, is a very boggy area which seems to be where Pastoria City and the nearby roots are based in modern-day Sinnoh, as well as Lake Valor and the home of the Diamond Clan. There's also the Solaceon ruins and a few other hillside views, though with a more rocky and marshy feel to them than in the Fieldlands. The third area is the Cobalt Coastlands, which, as you can imagine, has a lot of coastal areas and is based on the area around Sunnyshoal City in modern Sinnoh, somehow. You also have Stark Mountain, known as Firespit Island, which somehow, again, you'll hear that a lot, becomes a much larger island and volcano in approximately less than 200 years. Like, it becomes an entire island, it becomes massive, to be honest, in comparison to what it is in this game. Fourth up, you've got the Coronet Highlands. Of course, this area is very much a mountainside with a few caves, lots of ruins, and some icier climates at the summit. Finally, there's the Alabaster Icelands, based on the northern icy parts of the Sinnoh region in the modern day. You also have the Pearl Clan settlements, which would go on to become Snowpoint City, Snowpoint Temple, Lake Acuity, and lots going on as well. So, on paper, this seems great. Lots of variety, the choice to go to different places, etc. Well, yeah, it can be in many ways, but there are also a lot of ways that it goes wrong. For starters, looking at this map compared to the modern Sinnoh map is like looking at 2 very different maps with the same landmarks. I love Hisui, but the idea that it's old Sinnoh, while it works and is very much true, would be nicer if it lined up a bit more. However, all of that being said, it goes back to what I said in my BDSP video. This is the first time a region had been redesigned with the whole open zone thing in mind, so I do get it. This is not the way that remakes are normally done. But I do still wish that we'd gotten a modern Sinnoh DLC to see how they actually overlay properly. Aside from that, you've still got the fact that while this game feels like it's trying to be open world, it fails on a similar point to Sword and Shield, that being that it's not actually open. Let me explain. In my opinion, one of the key benefits that you get from having an open world Pokemon experience is that you get to make your own journey and be able to catch Pokemon that would normally be reserved to the late game, so they can properly feel like they are part of your team. For me, I knew I wanted to use a Hisui and Zoroark on my team for Legends Arceus as soon as it was announced, and when we knew that Alolan and Ninetales was going to be in the game, I knew I wanted to use one of those as well. To find out that, like with many other games, I'd have to wait until very much the end of the game to be able to use these Pokemon was super disappointing, as it meant that I didn't get the same attachment to them during the main story as my other members of my team. In many ways, the world still felt very linear, as you unlocked different areas as you progressed through the story, only unlocking the next one after you completed the story in the previous. There was very little backtracking involved up until the game's climax when you returned to the Coronet Highlands after the Alabaster Icelands, mimicking the progression of Diamond, Pearl and Platinum. As a positive, exploring the areas themselves for the first time was a ton of fun, and they're all very well designed. However, after a while, they can get quite boring, and the environments can feel quite monotonous. What really doesn't help, however, is the way that wild encounters work in this game. Pretty much every single encounter in this game is a fixed spawn, rather than the random spawning that you get in other Pokemon games. If you go to the Alabaster Icelands, you will always find the same Glalie and Zorua, and Kirlia and Abomasnow, and Snorunt, etc. All in the same places you expect to find them. They're almost always in the exact same locations every time you go to the area. The only time this isn't the case is because there's a chance that they don't spawn, due to the trying to give the illusion of a wild encounter. Once you've played this game as much as I have, you practically know where every single Pokemon spawns. One of the other biggest detractors for the open world in this game is the sheer amount of Pokemon with an aggressive disposition. By the end of the game, pretty much every Pokemon will kill you without mercy. Now, I can understand this from the challenge angle, but it gets super annoying very quickly, and all it really does is incentivize the player to use Hisui and Braviary to just fly over the world, which just makes the worlds less enjoyable, because you're not actually really exploring them, you're not really being able to engage with them properly. I also think that the zones do just get boring quite quickly because they are such small environments and all feel very samey, and again, having the same Pokemon show up every single time, you just know where everything is and there's just nothing there that's new, and it doesn't really feel exciting to go and find anything. That's not, however, to take away from the good that these open zones do. Like the DLC for Sword and Shield, this game's story takes place entirely in the open zones, aside from the parts in Jubilife Village, of course. They fully utilise their worlds, taking you to different parts of the maps to explore as parts of the story. Some feel more linear than others, especially the Coronet Highlands on your first journey, as you're following Ingo pretty much throughout, but overall they're pretty great at feeling like fun, explorable areas. One of the biggest problems that Legends Arceus' open world faces is that instead of trying to put a linear story into an open world, they try to put an open world into a linear story. And that doesn't really work. While the game is definitely built with these open zones in mind, it doesn't feel as though they fully understand why people praised open worlds like Breath of the Wild's Hyrule. One of the other main issues faced by Hisui is that it continues to have the same problems from the wild areas in that there are no NPCs around. There's a few you can chat to, and a couple of zones even have settlements where the Diamond and Pearl clans reside, but in terms of actual trainer battles, there are only 3 in the entire open world. They can appear randomly as well, it's not always there, but they all only have 1 or 2 Pokemon to fight. The battles aren't even hard, as in the slightest, and the only one that presents the tiniest smidge of challenge is Charm, as she'll often be able to use a move after she sends in her second Pokemon. Not that that actually provides any challenge after you reach a certain level. There are other trainer battles in the game, however they're all fought by choice in Jubilife Village, and there's a very small selection of opponents, so you're fighting the same battles over and over and over again, with very little challenge in the entire process. I think that one of the biggest problems with it, ultimately, is that in comparison to a normal Pokemon region that you can explore all of, even if it is linear, Legends Arceus' Hisui felt too controlled. I felt like I was only exploring a small amount of the region, and wanted to explore everything between the zones as well. Sinnoh in the present has such a variety of environments that you barely really see in Legends Arceus, especially considering how much they reduced the size of the post-game island, with the Battle Zone and Stark Mountain, and the giant desert as well. I think they should honestly have left Firespit Island and given us a much bigger area to explore in the post-game, based on the original post-game area of Sinnoh. The zones end up feeling empty and lifeless at times, and I think that we could really have done with them being either bigger, or us getting to explore the full region. So what about the environmental storytelling in Legends Arceus? It's a mixed bag, to be honest. There's a lot of good and a lot of not so great as well. We already touched on how Hisui doesn't line up with the present day Sinnoh very well, which can lead to it feeling like there's bad world building in that sense, but there's a lot more to talk about. Starting with the positives. The Coronet Highlands does environmental storytelling brilliantly. The ruined statues of Dialga, Palkia and Giratina, as well as the surrounding ruins, are done really well, highlighting the clear history of the region and its legends. Of course, in the game's climax, you then see the Temple of Sinnoh become Spear Pillar that we know from Diamond, Pearl and Platinum. And this was honestly such a great moment, because that makes Spear Pillar feel even more momentous in the modern games, because we now know what happened there in the past. This also is seen in other parts of the region, such as the Shrouded Ruins and Snowpoint Temple. We get a lot of backstory and world building for these locations, which makes them all feel properly realised. Unfortunately, there are a few parts of the world building which aren't so great, and worse, because this game is supposed to be a prequel to the modern Sinnoh games, some of what we see here is actually contradictory to the lore of those games. Celestic Town is stated to be the oldest town in the Sinnoh region. However, we see no real sign of it here. Well, sort of. It's somewhat hinted at that the Shrouded Ruins and Diamond Settlement are what becomes Celestic Town. But geographically, that really just doesn't work. Celestic Town is on the other side of Sinnoh to Lake Valor. However, they're within very quick walking distance. Meanwhile, you have Jubilife Village, which is not said to be one of the older towns of Sinnoh, like Eterna City and Celestic Town. If I'm honest, I don't even really get why this decision was made. It's not like having the Galaxy team be based in Eterna City would make that much overall difference to the story of the game. And to be honest, it would kind of make a bit more sense, because in the modern day, there is a Team Galactic base at the northernmost point of the city, which seems very similar to how Jubilife Village has the Galaxy Team base at the northernmost point of the village. The giant tree in the Heartwood also never goes explained, which feels a bit odd to be honest, especially as it doesn't actually appear in the modern Sinnoh region. But yeah, the lore surrounding the noble Pokemon and the world is quite nice, but again, it still feels a bit surface level, though it is interesting that we see depictions of characters' ancestors who feel as though we should learn about but never really do other than basic details, with Maxie, Archie and Alder's ancestors all playing an important role in Hisui's history. So that's Legends Arceus and the open zone system. It's a good system in many ways, but it also has a lot of flaws, and it's one of those not for me type of things. So now let's actually look at an open world attempt, when Pokemon decided to go all in, with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Scarlet and Violet were the first Pokemon games to be advertised as open world from their reveal, and on paper they offered exactly that. After you complete the tutorial section of the game, you're able to go and explore the world of Paldea fully. Great, right? Well, sort of. On paper, it's exactly what I wanted from an open world Pokemon game, but there are a number of flaws that bring it down. I spoke about this a lot in my full Scarlet and Violet review, which you can check out here, but let's focus on the open world and all of its strengths and flaws. Let's start off with one of the biggest positives I have to say about this map. Paldea is really fun to explore. There's such a rich variety in environments, with locations that make you wonder how you can explore them, and what you'll find there, just like in Breath of the Wild's Hyrule. You've got a relatively big map, although I'd personally prefer a bit larger, and you can find a lot to do within it, with it being full of trainer battles, towns and cities, wild Pokemon and items. There's a lot about this open world which is done very right, and it's a massive improvement on Legends Arceus and Sword and Shield. However, it's far from perfect. The big thing to point out is the lack of scaling in this game. Level scaling is very rarely in the games, however it had featured in both games we previously talked about, with the trainer in the wild area, as well as the trainer battles against the Misfortune Sisters in Legends Arceus. So why is it gone here, and why is that a big deal? The main reason is that it's an issue because Paldea is designed to allow you to explore wherever, and you are encouraged to make your own journey. What they don't tell you, however, is that your journey will be pretty much the exact same as everybody else's, as the levels of wild Pokemon and trainers are locked to the exact same levels throughout. So if you were to take on Iono before getting to find Katie, you would find Katie super easy to defeat. Alternatively, if you really wanted to rush to Glaciado Mountain and fight Grusha, you technically can, but you'll find that his Pokemon are still in the late level 40s in comparison to the teen levels of your Pokemon at the point in the game. One of the major frustrations is that this affects wild Pokemon as well, so you still can't get the ability to go out and catch other Pokemon early on. Personally, I find this super disappointing, as I really love the idea of being able to go and make your own journey, and being able to catch any Pokemon in the region from early on would be such a fantastic addition to that feeling. The other main problem that Paldea has was that the world ended up detracting from the game's story. I spoke about this a lot in my review of the game, but after the tutorials, Paldea is given 18 different points of interest, split into 3 different categories: gyms, titans, and Team Star bases. The story of the gyms is pretty non-existent. You go there, take on a gym, sometimes you'll have a little bit of dialogue with Nemona, a teacher, or a member of the Elite Four, but otherwise there's really not much. In the Titan Quest you get a bit more character-based story with Arven and his Mabostiff, but very little in the way of plot. Even when facing the Iron Treads, which, you know, of course is linked to the actual main story of the game. Starfall Street is pretty much the same. You get a short cutscene where the team leaders just stand around and chat for a bit after you defeat each one, but that really is it. Now I know what you're thinking. Saturn. This is the exact same method that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom used for their stories. I know. I don't particularly care for those games' stories either. In fact, the best story for the kind of era of the Wild is still Age of Calamity, despite the way it fucks over the actual timeline. Sorry, pardon my language there. Yeah, I think Age of Calamity still has the best story because you're actively participating in the story. Anyway, there are good parts to it. For example, having gyms be points of interest rather than done in a certain order, thanks to the story, is something I actually like a lot. In fact, I don't even mind having all of these points of interest that you can do in any order, though obviously no scaling, so certain limits to that. But it's the lack of story in between these points that is actually the real problem here. In previous games, you'd have the story of the games feel like it actually affected the region, but not so much here. The issue is that they don't want to tell a linear story in an open game. I can see why that is, of course. You don't want to lessen the feeling of openness in your first open world game. However, you kind of have to. Players will learn on their own to explore outside of what they're shown in the story if you incentivize it enough, which is another problem with Scarlet and Violet, which I cover more in depth in my review. However, hear me out here. You can't just do it in the same way, obviously, and everything will still feel like point of interest moments in some way, but there are ways that you can still tell a compelling story here. Say, instead of only seeing Team Star at their bases after you defeat 2 gyms, or something like that, they attempt to cause a ruckus in one of the towns, and the gym leader you just defeated recommends that you and Nimona go and assist in that situation, or something like that. That's just one method. You could also do it that when you get to certain points, there are set events, such as when you first reach Zapapico. Maybe there's a problem that you need to sort out, but don't have it telegraphed to the player from the beginning of the game as being a do this to check this off to the list of things to do. Or you could even have it be that the main story is completely separate to the 3 other ones. This one being told in a more linear fashion, which you would just go around to the points that it requires you to go for the plot. I'm thinking of games like Black and White 2, where Team Plasma would take over a town for a while, and you'd have to deal with that situation. But you know, here you'd also be able to move on and not do that situation, but you'd still have to come back to it to focus on the main story and to improve the main story there. But the best way to really talk about my solutions to these problems would be to fully describe my pitch for a Saturn-style open-world Pokemon game. We'll be doing that at the end of this video, but for now I still have a few things that I want to talk about in regards to Paldea, though admittedly I did already touch on them in my Scarlet and Violet review. Starting off with the way that they really didn't help themselves. I get what they were trying to achieve by giving the player Koraidon or Miraidon. It gives people a speedy way to travel across the region, and an easy way to provide upgrades to make the region more accessible. It makes sense, and in many ways, but in other ways it unfortunately makes things worse. Koraidon and Miraidon are so big and so fast that they absolutely tear through Paldea like no one's business. It makes the region feel even smaller than it already is, and makes the world feel quite pointless, as it just seems like they've given you a super speedy method to go from point to point on the map. As a positive of the open world in Scarlet and Violet, the map's layout is pretty good. There is a lot of good spacing for the different points of interest. The gyms and towns are all very well placed, with the Titans and Team Star bases feeling like they were properly spaced out as well. There's a lot of very good use of spacing in the game, and the different explorable environments are well placed and all feel like they've been given enough room to breathe and don't just feel crammed in there. We absolutely need to talk about the world building and environmental storytelling of Paldea, however. Like with Legends Arceus, it's a bit of a mixed bag. One of the most disappointing parts of the world building is the towers. In the game, these towers serve as the purpose of being able to survey the nearby area for points of interest, which would be cool if they weren't all heavily signposted to us on our maps. It would have made a ton of sense for these giant towers to serve some sort of purpose in Paldea's past, but we get literally no information on them at all. You also have the many random ruins around Paldea, which are usually home to Gimmighoul. There is no real explanation for these whatsoever, and like the Watchtower ruins in Sword and Shield, feel more like an excuse for the player to find some ghost types around the world. Now, I've created some theories as to what might have caused these to exist, specifically an idea that rogue Mega Pokemon ravaged Paldea as part of the ending of the war from 3,000 years ago, but that's pure speculation and entirely based on details I've surmised from my research into every Pokemon game in the last 12 years. Something which people really shouldn't have to do to come to a somewhat satisfying conclusion, which isn't even vaguely confirmed. Compare this to the numerous ruins we found across Hyrule in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. You have an event that we know caused pretty much all of the ruins across the kingdom in the Calamity. However, what these games do so well is telling you more about a lot of the ruins you explore, such as the ruins on the hill near Kakariko Village, where you can see a guardian died in the explosion, leading people to believe that that area was previously a bomb shop, something that Kakariko Village has been known to have in previous titles in the series. You also have ruins like the Akala Citadel ruins, which tell the story of how Hyrule's last stand fell at the end of the Calamity, and Blatchery Plain, where you can see that there was a massacre of Guardians, but later learn that this is where Princess Zelda awakened her sealing powers. Every ruin in that game has a story to tell, with enough information in the area to piece together at least a vague guess as to what those stories are. especially with further information from Age of Calamity showing us the world 100 years ago. All of this makes Paldea's lack of world building feel a bit disappointing. Even when you get inside Area Zero, there's still very little in the way of actual story, especially about how the Zero Lab was constructed, the mysterious markings, the research stations, the strange dishes at the top of the area that you can only easily get to at the end of the DLC, etc. It all feels like there could have been a lot more in the way of environmental storytelling to really help players understand the region's history and world. On the other hand, you have the shrines where the ruinous quartet are sealed away. These ruins are mysterious, yes, but thanks to the history lessons in the game, we learn their entire story and how the Pokémon came to be sealed there. They're given a full explanation, which makes you feel more compelled to actually unlock the ruins and find out what the ruinous Pokémon could actually be. That's pretty much all there is to say on the world building and environmental storytelling of Paldea, as well as the analysis we need to do on this region. We've covered a lot there, but now it's time to take a look at what we can expect from Lumiose City based on the previous title's executions. I've already touched on how redesigning a linear land for an open world game can be challenging, as seen with Hisui in Legends Arceus. Lumiose City is a much smaller area than the full Sinnoh region, and was pretty open already, though split into 3 sections in X and Y. Of course, in X and Y, there was a blackout, and nobody was allowed through aside from the countless NPCs going through while the lights were on, but you could explore the rest later on after you'd already done the Kalos power plant section. However, it seems that in Legends EA, it's going to be open from the beginning, which I was able to predict based on the locations of important structures in the game, such as the Looker Bureau and Quasartico Inc. building, but was then confirmed by the demo footage, where we can see that on the map. It seems to be open from the start of the game. To be honest, I kind of expected this anyway. I kind of felt that after Paldea, we're not really going to go back to linearity, because I think linearity's kind of had its time in the Pokemon series, at least in my opinion. But anyway, that's all for my conclusions later on. Anyway, however, also thanks to the demo footage, we can also see some of the issues that I talked about in my previous video are actually being fixed, specifically on the whole linear story in an open world thing. So far, I'm yet to play a game that does a linear story in an open world, at least fully, though my experience of open world games is rather limited by the fact that I only own a Switch 2, so I haven't played any of the classic Xbox, PC or PlayStation open world games like Red Dead Redemption 2, Elden Ring or Ghost of Tsushima. I've not even yet delved into Cyberpunk, despite it being on the Switch 2, but what we see seems to limit the player to certain areas during certain story moments. Now, I'm hoping that the game isn't too heavy-handed with this, making the game feel like previous titles in terms of linearity, but in terms of storytelling potential, this is most definitely a good thing. One of the other things that I'm most nervous for with the open world of Lumiose City is visual variety. Pokemon games are always incredibly varied in their environments, with deserts and volcanoes and oceans and jungles, but Lumiose City is not that at all. In fact, it's rather visually similar. Even the wild zones all look relatively similar to one another, with the exception of the Wild Zone 8, which seems to emulate a desert somehow, but again, we've theorised on that in the past. I know that this game was always going to have a very similar environment, but it somehow feels a bit nerve-wracking as we approach release to have such little environmental variety. Is there going to be enough to keep my brain visually interested? Hopefully yes, as I've been to known to play other games with very little environmental variety, but it is going to make for an interesting challenge for this game. However, keeping Lumiose City open might help to rectify that in part. Being able to explore all of Lumiose is going to be a lot of fun, and being able to explore at our own pace will make exploring Lumiose a much more interesting experience than it was in X and Y. There's not really much for us to talk about on this yet, but it's certainly something I'd like to come back to after I get my hands on the game next month. Seeing how Lumiose has changed since X and Y and the story that will come with that is one of the biggest excitements for me with this game, and the reception to both my map videos reflects that I'm not the only one excited to dive back into Lumiose City and the Kalos region once again. Now, let's talk about whether the open world is actually right for Pokemon. I've been very critical in this video. That might have led you to the idea that I believe that an open world is not, in fact, right for the Pokemon series. And you'd be dead wrong in that assumption. I actually think that in concept, the Pokemon series being open world works really well, as I kind of accidentally revealed my conclusion in the previous section without meaning to. I'm a big fan of open world games, especially the recent Zelda titles, and I think that there's a lot of potential there for the Pokemon series. I spoke earlier about how the series has a lot of potential with catching Pokemon at any point in the game, rather than locking a lot of them but to the late game areas. That and giving people a world to explore which has lots of fun secrets for them to uncover would be amazing. Now, I understand that I am a player who is intrinsically motivated by exploration in video games. I've spent a total more than 700 hours across Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, just really exploring Hyrule to the fullest, and would love it if a Pokemon game could allow me to do the same thing. I also understand that most players aren't motivated by that, and could require some more rewards for exploring. Now, you can't exactly replicate how the Zelda games do this with shrines, but there are definitely ways that you can do this with rarer Pokemon, items to help power up your team, more challenging battles that give interesting rewards, or even in games that have gimmicks tied to items like Megastones or Z-Crystals, or even Terra Shards and Max Mushrooms, you could make them more exploring rewards, you know? There's a lot you can do with that. The Pokemon series has always felt like an adventure, and I'd love for that to be a major part of the series going forward. When the Crown Tundra came out, it was almost universally praised as the best part of Sword and Shield. To me, that seems very clear that people want to be immersed in the exploration of the series. Paldea claimed that it was going to deliver on this, but it failed immensely. The same is true of the hidden treasure of Area Zero. Having an open world gives you so much potential from an adventuring sense, as you don't feel like you're being railroaded to a location, and the discoveries you make feel like actual discoveries. Think about in Breath of the Wild, finding the Forgotten Temple for the first time, or the Ranch Ruins in their uncannily familiar design. Having the Pokemon series, like finding an old temple where you can find not only some rare Pokemon, but also some more of the series lore, that would be amazing. We even saw this in action with the Abyssal Ruins in Unova and the Lake of the Sun and Moon in Alola. Even the Regitemples in both Hoenn and the Crown Tundra, as those aren't particularly signposted to the players in terms of their locations. Another one of the greatest joys of the Pokemon series is being able to craft your own team. I've spoken on this a lot already, but ultimately I think players should be able to craft their teams with any Pokemon they want to if they go out of their way to explore locations early. But the question is, would this work? Say you went out of your way to find a Dreepy really early on in the game, is that then unfair? Well, you could say yes, given Dreepy is the first stage of a Dragon-type Pokemon and a pseudo-legendary, but you have to take into account the different levels that Pokemon evolve at. Dreepy evolves into Dracloak at level 50 and Dragapult at level 60. Now personally, I think that it could be a lot more fairly balanced, like having it evolve into Dracloak at level 35 and then Dragapult at 60. But the point is, Pokemon already sort of balances this out. And this isn't just a single example. Even Pokemon like Rufflet and Vullaby don't evolve until the level 50s, which again I think should be rebalanced slightly, but it's worth pointing out. But also, it's about giving players choice. If someone wants to catch 6 pseudo-legendary Pokemon before taking on Gym 1, train them up and stomp across the entire game, that's for them to decide. Alternatively, if a player wants to go about things in the traditional way, then they also can. But giving players the ability to choose is always going to be a good thing. But now, it's time that we actually talk about how I would create an open world Pokemon game. You might already have a good idea of that based on what we've covered so far, but now I'm going to lay it out clearly for all of you. Also, just as a bit of a reminder, I am actually a game design student myself, so this concept should be pretty grounded, and I'm not going to try and go overboard here. I'm also going to keep it relatively focused on the world design of an open world nature, and rather than documenting an entire game concept. But if you want to see a full game pitch, I'd be more than happy to make that video in the future. This is the part of the video that I've been really looking forward to. I have been wanting to document this for a long time, and now I finally can. To keep this simple, we're going to use a region that already exists, specifically the Galar region. I feel like there's a lot I can do with the Galar region that people can easily understand, so let's just get right into how this would work. So let's just remind ourselves of what Galar looks like. You've got the clear wild area, as well as the other raised sections where all the towns and routes are. On the artwork for the region, you also have a lot of extra space that you can't explore in-game. A lot less than other regions. But however, we're going to do a Paldea here, and allow you to explore everywhere that you can see on this map. This opens up more mountainous areas, beaches, small islands, more oceanic areas, and more forests as well. This gives us a lot of potential, so let's see how this would work. The second thing that we need to do is make this map a bit more cohesive. Environments from what were the routes would be taken further and extended into new areas and what was the wild area. For example, Glimwood Tangle would now extend towards the beaches to the west, creating a sort of mythical beach with more ground and fairy types, and as well as some more grass, water, psychic, dark and poison types. I'd also do the same for the Route 6 area and make the Spikemouth area more overtly dark type. I'd also add a few more towns and cities to the map, just to pad it out a bit. Maybe spread out some of the key areas. There'd be more key landmarks as well, based on British historical sites, like Stonehenge or Warwick Castle. Of course, without the need to differentiate the raised sections from the wild area, we'll also add some more connective points to make the region more easily manoeuvrable. The start of the game would also still be relatively linear. Like Paldea before Mesagoza, as a way to ease players into the open world, but the area between Posterwick, Wedgehurst and Professor Magnolia's house, and everything in between would be fully open, and be a bit like the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild, with the story adjusting to get your first partner earlier on. You'd still have a linear story, beats like exploring the Slumbering Weald and meeting Zacian and Zamazenta, but otherwise it's a much more open experience. Once you've had your second rival battle with Hop, the world opens up, with you taking the train to where the wild area began, but you learn that you could just walk back to Wedgehurst if you want to. It would be a bit tough in some ways, because you'd need to scale some mountains. On that note, let's talk about traversal. I'd take some cues from Alola in the Ride Pokémon system, as I think that really helped immerse me more, and built a connection with some lesser known Pokémon. But here we're going to take that even further. You're actually going to have to catch these Pokémon themselves as side quests, and you can register them to your Ride pager. The encounters at the start would be fixed and would be much easier to catch than normal, but would also reward your explanation in giving you more traversal options. You could catch a Galarian Rapidash to traverse the world more quickly, a Dreadnought to cross the water, a Colossal to scale mountains, and a Sandaconda to make traversing caves more easy. But we'll come back to that last one. These fixed versions of the Pokemon will be pretty weak, but later on into the game you could choose to catch others of these species, which can take their place. And you can use them in battle, to really strengthen your bond with them, sort of combining the Alola and Let's Go methods of Ride Pokemon. But unlike in Scarlet and Violet, you wouldn't have to choose between battling and riding. This also means that if you found a shiny of any of these Pokemon, you could use them for your Ride Pokemon as well. As you explore through the game, you can find upgrades for your Ride Pokemon, which will upgrade their stamina, speed, or abilities. You'd find these in hidden corners around the world, or as rewards for strong trainer battles, or something like that, almost emulating the shrines from Breath of the Wild and Tis the Kingdom. Now I know what you're thinking. Where's the flying Corviknight? Is it still Corviknight taxis? No. Here's the thing. I'm not including a flying Pokemon here. Cue the shock horror reactions. Let me explain. Fast travel has been a major part of the Pokemon series for as long as it's existed, and I think it could do with a bit of a redesign. Now, all of this is a concept, and I'm not entirely married to this idea, but instead of having open fast travel like we've had with the fly mechanic since Gen 1, we'd build on the train network seen in Sword and Shield. You'd have train stations in every town and city, and a number in the open world as well, and fast travel would have to be using the train stations. This would also motivate players to explore further and utilise their Ride Pokemon, as it means they can't just teleport to other locations. I'd like to include an option where you can also actually explore the train itself during the journey, like the SS Aqua in the Johto games, as well as the idea of implementing the battle subway as part of this in some way, maybe with Ingo and Emmett returning to be battled as well. However, that would remain an optional choice for the players when using the fast travel feature, so sometimes they might want to and sometimes they might not. Next up, let's talk about the deeper exploration of caves in the game. Galar already has 2 caves in Galar Mine number 1 and 2, and these will be greatly expanded. With the help of your Sandaconda, you'll be able to traverse multiple layers of these caverns, and go deeper and beyond what you could in Sword and Shield. These caves would be closer in size to classic Pokemon caves, making them more dungeon-like to really gain some fun exploration. Now here's the thing where here's where things get fun. Why explore them? Well, the rewards would be worth it. In some caves, it could be that you could find max mushrooms, or tough trainer battles with rare items or rewards, or even some super rare Pokemon like Larvesta and Volcarona, Heatran, the Cantonian legendary birds, etc. And this doesn't just go for caves. Rewards like these would be around the entire world. Exploring the icy peaks near Winden, you might stumble on a shrine where you can meet the Alolan legendary Pokemon. Or if you're exploring the Glimwood Tangle, maybe you could find yourself encountering a Xerneas or Cresselia. It doesn't just have to be legendary Pokemon either. It can be strong and rare normal Pokemon like Rune Regus. There would also be a lot more caves across the Pokemon world in this way as well. As for scaling in this game, you can probably already tell from what I've said in the previous sections of this video, but I'd use a scaling system which scaled to the player's party Pokemon levels, basing it on the highest levels in the party. I'd have gym leaders and trainers and wild Pokemon scale based on this, but still allowing a range of levels in the wild, from lower levels to higher ones, but the rarity of different level ranges would scale with your party. For example, in the area between Postwick and Wedgehurst, at the start of the game, you'd find low-level Wooloo, Rookidee, Nickit, Galarian Zigzagoon, Blipbug, etc. But you'd also see a few higher level, like level 20-odd, Pokemon around, with even the odd Corvisquire, Dottler, Galarian Linoon, and even Dubwool around. Though these would be more challenging for the player to encounter, of course. Returning to the area later on in the game, after you become champion, you'd find more high-level and evolved Pokemon here, like Corviknight, Obstagoon, Orbeetle, Dubwool, and Thievul, but still with a few lower-leveled pre-evolved Pokemon around as well. This would apply to the entire game, and would also scale if you were to then change out your party, so you then started with another team of level 5s, then they would go back to how they were at the start of the game. Trainers would also catch more Pokemon and evolve their Pokemon as you progress throughout the game as well. So if you miss a trainer fight with youngster Jimmy in the area between Wedgehurst and Professor Magnolia's house, if you were to fight him later on, you might find his Yamper is now a Boltund, and he's caught a Corviknight and an Obstagoon too. Facing Milo later on in the game might also be a challenge as well, as he might have his Gigantamax Appleton, Sarina, Shiftry and Ludicolo with him. I could also very easily see him having a Go-Goat as well, given goats are pretty common here in the UK. I kind of said what I needed to about story progression in the section on Paldea, but it would basically be that you'd be following two different stories, with one focusing on the gym challenge and the other focusing on the Darkest Day. You could do one without touching the other, but the two would also tie into one another in some ways, with characters crossing over, like Leon, Hop, Rose and Oleana. I'd also want to include a lot more in the way of environmental storytelling. I'd want to include more history in the Galar region that wasn't just related to the Darkest Day. As a Brit myself, I felt that British history wasn't really touched on enough by Sword and Shield. I'd include references to Shakespeare, the BBC, and some of our media, like a reference to the Great British Bake Off with an alchemy-themed contest that you can partake in, more references to the Hooniverse in some way, etc. But there would be absolutely more going on in the way of environmental storytelling, from history told through structures to hidden lore pieces that could be found by exploring the world. Of course, I don't know exactly how it would look, but there's just a bit of an insight on that from, obviously this is not a full game pitch, this is just me kind of rambling about how I would do an open world Pokemon game. As for the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra, they'd be available in the game and explorable throughout. They'd both also be redesigned in line with the full Galar region, and their stories would also scale to the player's party. The fun thing would be that you could walk from Postwick to the Crown Tundra without having to get the train, with the help of your Colossal. And same for the Isle of Armor by surfing on Dreadnought. The additional content of these areas would also be in line with the new content for Galar, such as the additional details and settlements. I'd also add a lot more between the main Galar region and the Crown Tundra, based entirely on Scotland, with cities and towns and structures based on places like Edinburgh, Glasgow and the Scottish Highlands and more. Of course, the entire region's routes and maps would have to be redesigned from the ground up, and as good as I may be at concepting, actually drawing that out for this video is maybe a bit beyond my capability, as I'm writing this, let alone recording it, far too late compared to when I wanted to have this out. But if you want me to talk about this more and kind of expand on these concepts, I'd be more than happy to. But I'd need to know that it's something that you guys actually want to see. And hey, I might be able to do more, but if that were to become a full video, But for now, that's pretty much everything I've got to say, so thank you for sticking with me. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you everyone, and I'll see you soon. ZA is right around the corner, and you can bet that there'll be a lot in terms of discussions as soon as that game releases. As a reminder, we have a community Discord linked in the description, an Instagram with updates, channel memberships where you can see videos early and get some exclusive content as well, and just to remind everyone, ZA leaks are forbidden in the comments section. Thank you all so much for watching, but for now, au revoir.